All right, hello, and thank you everyone for showing on up today. We are here with some very amazing and esteemed panelists here for our panel called Mission Diversity and Inclusion Within Geek Culture. I am Dr. Anthony Bean, and I am moderating this, and I want the wonderful panelists to go and introduce themselves.
Hello, Narak Dickerson, Saidi. I work with Tony at the TLOS project doing psychological assessments and testing. And I'm very happy to be here. Can't wait to get started.
Hello, all. I am Dr. Rougeau Burns. You guys can just call me Dr. RB or Gaston, whichever. And I do a lot of psychological testing over here in West Texas. So I'm over here in Lubbock. I work with kids in the foster care system, work with families, work with couples, and just trying to help them see issues that they may not see themselves and kind of get to the place they want to get to. And so I'm excited to be here and talk about diversity and what it means to me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mitch Reed. I'm the president and CEO of the United Experience in Northwest Florida, and we're committed to advancing the world through gaming, education, and charity. Today, we're happy to talk about diversity and inclusion today and its importance in geek culture.
Hello, I'm Julia Stammen. I'm a licensed professional counselor in Austin, Texas, and I have a private practice called Heart of the Realm, where I see adults who identify as geeks, gamers, and misfits.
Hi, I'm Lodestar. I'm a school counselor for a private day school for special ed students in the Washington, D.C. area on the Virginia side. I also do work with dance and adoptees from all over Asia. And happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Connell. I'm a board certified psychologist working in private practice out of Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm also the co-founder of Geeks Like Us. I do a live play Dungeons and Dragons game, and I do a lot of trainings with Leyline Geek Therapy, and I'm really excited to be here today.
Thank you all so very much. That was very impressive credentials, and I'm very excited to have you all here. So first off, let's start off with what is diversity? How do we see as diversity in our area, our life, our professional life, our regular life?
So for me, diversity is being able to walk into organizations and see yourself there in the population. It's being able, it's being there and feeling like you belong. Feeling like when you walk in, people will understand where you're coming from. And even if they don't, they're able to feel free to ask you about your experiences. It doesn't limit you, diversity. It doesn't limit your scope of practice if your area is diverse. Yeah, it's just inclusion for me. Yeah.
I've been watching a lot of Hamilton lately, and there's this song where it talks about I want to be in the room where it happens. And that's what diversity means to me, is that a lot of times you have a small subset of people making decisions for a lot of people. And then when there's blowback or when there's pushback, and it's like, well, I never thought to think of your experience as like an African American man for me, or like an Asian American woman, or anything like that. I never thought to think of those experiences. Then that's when I think about why diversity is so important, is that you want to have as many people in the room as possible.
Yeah, so for me, when I think about diversity, I think about the range of human differences in its totality. Any dimension that can be used to differentiate a group or people from one another would be diversity. And I think it's important to delineate the differences between diversity and inclusion, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add to that. I think it really approaches it from what diversity looks like on paper and what it feels like for a person to walk in and feel welcome and that sense of inclusion. Yeah, I think that covers it.
So, fun story. I was asked this question for my first job interview at Abercrombie. And after all those lawsuits happened back in the day, and just in the spur of the moment, I was like, diversity is experiencing, witnessing something that's different from yourself. And I just kind of went on this like panic monologue, and I was like, wait, that was a great definition though. So I've kept it ever since. because what's diverse for me is not what's diverse for someone else. It's just expanding your world and experiencing something that you're not used to or usually a part of.
Yeah, I think Danny, that kind of captures what I was thinking perfectly of this, like when we talk about going into a room where we see ourselves represented, but we also see not ourselves represented. We want to see people who have a different experience and have a different idea. And that, when we all come together with these different ideas, it helps us create new things and that are more representative of humanity as a whole rather than one small subset.
So I think that you all do amazing jobs of kind of talking about the idea of diversity in there. How have we seen this diversity in our lives different areas of our lives, and the ability to either sometimes acknowledge that what we're doing is not as diverse or as inclusive as it could be, and how do we actually approach that to other people?
That's a really good question. Can you ask that one more time?
Absolutely. So in our lives, we have tons and tons of different places that we go to, right? Our home, our work,
Mhm.
restaurant, a football game. It doesn't really matter. Even our geek culture, we have tons of D&D dragons, Dungeons and Dragons groups. We have anime conventions. There's tons of
Uh-huh.
diversity and lots of inclusion in there. How do we approach it when we see that maybe it isn't as diverse as it could be, or if there's something that's falling short? Because to give an idea, like each year, I believe the statistic is that more than 2 million people voluntarily just leave a specific place, whether it's a convention, a group, or a even a psychological compendium group of clinicians, because they don't feel like it's as diverse, or it doesn't feel like it's as inclusive as it could be. When we acknowledge that and see that, how do we go forward and actually use that to our advantage to really talk about these different topics that we need to bring into those conversations?
Okay. I think diversity has to be something that is on the forefront. I think people think that diversity is going to happen automatically. In our culture, that's not something that's society, that's not something that really happens. I think in organizations, it has to be something that's on the agenda, that's being focused on, that's talked about. Um, just as everything else that we talk about, how we're going to grow a business, how we're going to expand in what we do, we need to work on how we're going to expand in diversity in whatever we do. I think that's how we really focus on it and make sure that it's something that's being taken care of. It's something that's being fostered and nurtured in organizations.
Yeah, I like that opinion, Dr. Nirak, because when I think of diversity, I don't think many people are pushing for it. Like we sometimes say we are, like we sometimes have it in our company bylines that we're pushing for diversity and inclusion, because it's hard. Like when you to be diverse requires you to say, let me do some self-exploration and let me determine where I'm at, where my company may be at, where the people I'm around may be, and then let me determine how I can fix those blind spots. And that requires a lot of insight. And that's a really hard thing to get. And so when I was thinking about that question, the thing that kept popping up for me is kind of representation in gaming. And for me, being a movie person, I've been watching a lot of Netflix lately because we were all in quarantine. And one of the most interesting things, I've been watching a lot of sci-fi fantasy series where the protagonist is a person of color. And it has been the most mind-blowing experience because most of the time, when I'm watching these things, it's like, well, if this person is a white male between the ages of like 15 and 34, they're going to be the protagonist. They're the hero of this story. And so it's nice to kind of have these tropes turned on their head. And you can almost tell like it's this intentional way to bring people in. And I'm loving that because it's I didn't realize it was lacking until I looked around and said, man, like all my Game of Thrones heroes or all my, Lord of the Rings heroes are all a certain demographic. They're all a certain trope. And now we're pushing back on that. And so I think it's about being able to recognize it's a blind spot. And for me, it was not even knowing it was a blind spot until recently.
Yeah, I love where this is going. So I'm just going to build on the conversation a little bit. I want to add the word and term inclusivity, throw a definition out there. I think loosely default is the involvement and empowerment where the inherent worth of all people are recognized. And I think that that starts with process or thinking processes. And I think that from my experience in the virtual space and the physical space in person, diversity changes rapidly with culture, changes rapidly with the medium in which people are interacting. And so, for instance, in my experience in MMO and the MMO space, diversity was great. It was wonderful. And most times you didn't even realize who you were playing with. And so, by the nature of people, we want to belong to each other in community. And it was fun to watch what I think as an ideal paradigm where people play together regardless of anything just to accomplish things and share in that experience together. So I think that those realms, those anonymous realms, and being transparent, they're stronger because they didn't have that cultural bias or that background to shape it. Whereas if you go to the physical, then you start seeing what you guys were just talking about, where diversity starts to fall off the map a little bit. But in general, where I saw all of it fall short was inclusivity, because even though in the MMO world we were diverse, people still felt excluded from activities based upon how they interact with other people, based upon what people learned of them and their relationships that built. So I think that inclusivity is really where we fall the shortest.
I think we're still going in this order, so I'll go next. It's my turn.
You can go in whatever order feels natural. This is a conversational, so.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this kind of a lot on my own lately, of the different levels that diversity can happen and what we can do about it, which I don't know if we're getting to later. But I think it happens on so many different levels, including access. So just from the very start, like if you are in a position of power and that you're running a group, I primarily do like tabletop role play games as a geeky social hobby. Anyway, I also read a lot of graphic novels, but if you're in a position of power and you're reaching out to recruit people for your group, like where are you reaching out to? What communities are you reaching out to? I think that's kind of the first step. It's like access and entry into that space. And then once they actually get into the space, are they seeing people like them? Are they seeing diversity, like Dr. Connell was saying, within that group? And then like, so it's like happening around the table, and then it's happening what's actually happening in the game of what are the characters that you're playing with, what is the world building like. So it can happen at so many different layers that I think if we just put a little bit of like mindfulness to rather than on autopilot of like, this is just like how I'm gonna write, or like I know these people, so I'm just gonna like start with the people I know, which is okay. But just stepping outside of your comfort zone a little bit there to make sure that you are creating those diverse spaces.
Mindfulness and purposefulness are always the two words I like to mesh.
That's good.
Can we repeat the question summarized actually, so I make sure I answer the right thing?
Oh man, you're gonna do that to me? Oh my God. Summarizing it is basically we see diverse cultures. We see all of this diversity and inclusion in a lot of different areas, but we approach it in different ways. But we also different environments approach it in different manners. How have we kind of seen that approach work and maybe fail in some kinds? And then obviously at the end of this, Julie, I'm gonna want you to talk a little bit more about those levels that you mentioned.
Thank you. Okay, so the way I've confronted it, so right when I was like heading into college, that's when Tumblr was getting huge. And I learned so much. I know everyone makes fun of Tumblr, but I learned so much through Tumblr. And I will defend it until my dying day. But also just me as a personal person, I'm very confrontational and I'm very comfortable doing it. And I kind of learned from something I heard Rosa Parks said back in the day, where the safest place to be is in the public eye, because then almost nothing can be done and people won't notice. If you are right in front and center of everyone, as I usually do when I confront things, like people see, people think, more importantly, and hopefully do something about it later on.
Yeah, I think to build on this, like both what Danny and Julie just said, of that idea of being intentional and thinking about it and like having to go and intentionally do things. I think when you were first asking this question, Dr. B, the thing that's really struck me with this is you have to be willing to have uncomfortable conversations. Like if you are in a space and you notice a lack of diversity, you notice that people are not engaging in the way you want to see them engage, and you're not seeing representation the way you want to represent, be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations so that we can address it, and don't just stop at the first, like, I think we're doing a good job. Be willing to be a scientist and ask, like, what evidence do we have that we're doing a good job? What's measurable steps have we taken in the past, and how can we know this for sure? And then also, like Dr. Ivy was saying too, of having that inclusion in media and understanding just how important it is. Whether it is you're running a live stream D&D game and you're having a wide range of different types of players, different types of characters represented, it's really important for people to be able to see themselves in media.
Julia, do you mind talking a little bit about those different levels just really quick?
Yes. That was my summary, what I said before. Is it okay to kind of shake it up and like, does anybody have any add-ons to those levels of like access, and then what the people look like, and then what like the game content looks like?
Shake away.
I mean, so to give you an idea, like after we talk about levels, I definitely want to go into the different geek areas, such as anime, where I know Lodestar is going to go into some stuff as well. I know Megan's going to go into D&D a little bit, and I know Nirak, man, we brought you into some geek fold here, so we're going to have a lot of fun with this. But I think that if we kind of brush up
Well,
a little bit more of that type of stuff too, might be really beneficial to help flush
so
those
then
out.
before we do that deep dive, I did want to add on to Dr. Megan's point about just media representation, because I think that was really cool. So as a Black man, I had two different experiences watching these really old timey Arthurian legend shows. One was A Letter to the King. So I'm no spoilers if you guys haven't seen it. Great show, right? In it, protagonist is a young biracial boy, right? But the way that they approach race in there is that they basically say that like there's these three different clans that have been at war for a long time, and if you're African American, you're in this one clan. And so so race is a prevalent part of the show, right? And it's an interesting watch because as an African American man, like who am I going to identify with? Like I'm probably not going to identify with anybody else other than this young biracial protagonist, right? And I think it's a similar experience for other people of color when they're watching those shows. I remember watching Game of Thrones, and finally season 4, we get an African American individual in there, or a Black person in there, and it's like, well, he's a slaver, like that's his job, like that's how we got him into this thing. Even though it's a sci-fi world, we're still bound by those rules. But then I had an interesting experience watching Cursed. We finished that recently, and in that one you have this huge biracial cast. So like Arthur is African American. There's other characters that are clearly from different nationalities, different ethnicities, and it's a really interesting experience, like watching this happen and having no mention of race at all. And I really thought that was, when we do kind of talk about that intentionality before, and how these guys intentionally chose to express that. I had the most interesting experience watching a show where like race and Arthur being Black had nothing to do with whether or not he was how the story was going to progress, or the primary wielder being a woman had nothing to do with the fact that we needed to get the sword or anything like that. And that was such an interesting and unique experience that I'm 33 and I've never had, for all the sci-fi and for all the media that I've ever watched and consumed, I've never had that experience. And I think that says a lot. I think it says we have a lot of ways to go, but that also in some ways, we're also on the right track. So back to the levels, Julie. But I just wanted to get that in. I thought that was just kind of something I didn't want to miss, is how important representation is to me.
No, I mean, that's definitely one of the levels that I think about is representation. Once they actually get through the barriers, so access, being financial, where the geek interests are, are there free library, graphic novels? Are there free games that a local comics store is running? Things like that. And also timing of groups. I think there's some access with that too. Are you running it during like a normal work schedule, or, you know, whatever it might be? So I feel like that's like almost that first level, even getting into the geek interest, the geek realms. And then so I feel like a thing that we could work on is, you know, the antidote to those things, right? Making it free, making it accessible, as well as reaching out to different communities. I don't know about saying more about that.
Well, and I think one thing that we also should keep in mind too, when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, is neurodiversity. And how do we make our gaming spaces, our conventions, other spaces welcoming for people? I do a series through Geeks Like Us called Psychology at the Table that is designed to help people understand how to help their friends who are struggling, whether it's through a mathematics disorder, being autism spectrum, anxiety, depression, whatever, just so that we can better be inclusive of those people who maybe from the outside look like us, but inside are struggling with something, and how can we be inclusive in that way? And there's, I know a lot about the D&D world, not as much about some of the other gaming worlds, but like, as someone who struggles with written language from dyslexia, there is a dyslexic character sheet that is a lifesaver, and it is so wonderful, and it helps organize the character sheet in a way that makes sense to my brain. And finding tools and resources like that can, and becoming familiar with those as well, so that other people can feel like they have that ability to join you, and finding those tools that help make it easier for people to join in the geek space or any space.
Actually, along with that line, my sister has a processing disorder that really manifests through reading as well, but she also really loves anime. So she always has to hunt down the dubs of everything. And when we can't, or even just like when we're watching movies and like, you know how Star Wars has the opening and just scrolls up slowly? Like my friends have gotten so used to the fact that I just instantly read it so that she can follow along out loud. And it took them about a year and a half before they all fully realized why I did it, even though they knew and they just didn't connect the dots. So it's just the small things like that, that's, yeah, in a way that's even small advocacy, because it showed other people like, hey, we've all been friends for years, and it finally clicked.
Mitch, what about you? Where I know you're based in Florida. How are you kind of seeing a lot of these different diversity aspects, whether it's from the brain diversity versus different cultural diversity? How are you kind of experiencing that, especially using United XP?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. So I think one is the initiative that you and I have actually talked about. And so, as you guys know, sometimes people with learning disabilities are one of the first demographics overlooked, because a lot of times organizations look at them and they go, well, what value added are they? And they don't take the time to get to figure out what value are they, right? And so I would argue this is a point of a lack of diversity and inclusivity, especially with them. So speaking to Dungeons and Dragons, we're currently working a program right now with an executive director, an entire team of folks in an organization who want to take the next leap and utilize D&D to facilitate a job interview, to help give them the social skills they need and walk them through the process of doing that. So that's something that we're looking to develop for free for them as a program of record. And the reason we're doing it is because in this area especially, we're almost 10 years behind in STEM. We're almost a decade behind in getting help for adults who have learning disabilities. And so they're at a major disadvantage with major budgetary restriction and constraints. And all as a result of my segue, my next point here is what I call a paradigm shift, where we're lagging behind in this particular region and other regions too, not just here. And so people are always asking me, now that I've been talking to leaders and organizational leaders, I've been talking to local senior community leaders about, well, we just don't understand why there's so many issues. And I said, well, at what level are we educating and advocating to this young generation about what the future looks like, and particularly in the geek space? Because almost 90% of our children growing up now operate in some continuum of that geek space of some type. And my answer is, we need to learn how to love people as people. And if we can get to the point to where we're thinking that way, and it's not, oh, I have to help out that person because they're hurting. It's, oh, I want to help out that person. When people start reacting in a way that's loving, then you know that their baseline is a lot closer to where it should be. And I think that we need to be striving as a people to get to that baseline. I think everyone here is talking about what should a person look like in their normal state. And I think that's what we're trying to get to.
Nirek, I have a unique question for you. Is when you started working for the Telos project, you had a weird experience. I'm going to call it a weird experience because you got introduced to uh, anime in some form by another person in I. What was that like for you? That experience? I think that talking about like being on the outside of the bubble and then kind of being brought in slowly is a unique experience that needs to be shared a little bit.
Oh yeah, it was overwhelming and intimidating to be brought into the anime world just because it was something different. And like I shared with you before, my brother is a gamer, he's a geek, he's anime, he's all these things. So when you guys would tell me stuff, I would come home and talk to him and he'd be like, yeah, duh. And I'm like, oh, my bad. I'm sorry, I'm not in your world. So help me, bring me into this world so that I know and I can communicate with you and I can communicate with people at work. Um, and then to learn more about anime, it's just an eye-opening experience how much it relates to kids and how empowering anime can be and how many positive themes and the character arcs. I mean, it's just like this whole world opened up, this whole world of positivity and joy. I mean, when I started watching the animes that I've watched, they're just so creative. And then I started getting into the more darker animes. And so I'm like, oh, this is oh, okay. Yes. Give me more. So it's been a great journey for me and I appreciate that. Yeah.
Would you say that with your brother in that experience, it allowed you to kind of form a different style of bond, a different experience with him?
Oh yeah. Oh
In what
yeah.
way?
We can have conversations about anime that will then branch off to life, to things that's going on with him and how if he was that character, what he would do in the situation. So and he's ready to have somebody to share that with because no one else in the household, my aunt, she watches anime but not as much. No one else is really around to share that with him besides his geek friends online. But he really wants to share that with his family. He really wants to connect with us on that level, and I think a lot of gamers and geekers want to connect with their family but they feel that they don't know how or they can't introduce this information to their family because their family like I don't get it, I don't understand. And that's where that inclusivity has to come into play. Like it's okay, learn something new. I mean, anime is freaking amazing. It is awesome. So I'm so very thankful and it's helped me very much connect with my brother on a different level. Yeah.
And I think that speaks to a lot to just not anime, but just like the human condition. And I hate to get super philosophical, but I've noticed so much in couples therapy that it's not a lot of my couples who are just like so angry and so confrontational, but that it's almost this sense that like we want to connect and we don't know how. And to kind of hear you talk about how you connected with your brother and like this really kind of almost niche thing became something you guys could build on. I think that's what I love about geek culture. That's what I love about being a part of something like this, is that I can say something. Like earlier I was talking to Tony about Halo, and it's like I can tell him about this thing, and we're immediately back in that place. Being able to build off this thing and being able to say, well, man, like, isn't this thing crazy? And then Tony will be like, well, hey, man, have I introduced you to this thing? I remember one time he introduced me to this one goofy anime, and I was like, I don't think I'm gonna like this, man. He goes, just give it a shot. I said, okay. And all of a sudden, I'm here watching this boy like become a castle, and he's trying to find his friend, and it's just like I'm here for this, like whatever you need, man. And so just the fact that it can build those types of bridges, and I think that as human beings, that's what we want to do. But I oftentimes find in my line of work that it's a struggle to get there. It's a struggle to say, I want to connect, but I don't know how.
Well, and jumping outside of my lane slightly as a psychologist, but like looking at like greater anthropology, we can look at a lot of like these geek stories through anime, through video games, through comic books as our modern mythology. Story is what unites us, and like diving into understanding stories and these tropes and looking at these characters and their hero arcs and stuff. And it's how we understand the world and understand ourselves. And so I think it's really cool that we're being a little bit more explicit with like choosing the mythology that we engage in and then shaping the mythology that we engage in by saying like, nope, this one's okay, but we need more inclusivity. So let's make it this way. This is okay, but I want more of this. And so we're getting to see that nowadays. And it's really interesting and cool.
It's really cool too, because like being on the school front and working with students specifically, that's most of my day is talking to parents like, we need them to stop watching this. And most of my students are autistic, so they have their hyperfixation. So, and I'm like, but is it bad that they're watching like Naruto so much? Not necessarily, because here, and then it's me teaching the parents, like, if you watch it with them, one, it'll make the connection we were talking about, and two, you can pull those little like tiny things and spin it in their world, and it teaches them so many philosophical lessons and so many life lessons. And I also do it a lot with Kingdom Hearts, because if you ever play Kingdom Hearts, it's just a big mindfulness trip. It's all it is.
So one of the things that we've been kind of slowly veering ourselves into is the idea of being more inclusive and diverse in a lot of different areas, anime, D&D, video games. But we continue to see a lot of different protagonists. Obviously be white male stereotypical, and a lot of people are trying to break from that, and I know D&D is making a big surge right now, and so that's kind of where I was going to bring up Megan next to kind of explain what is D&D doing currently, and what are the hopes for that type of stuff, and why did they choose to do this?
I think, well, they're wanting to. I think from a business perspective, honestly, what Wizards of the Coast is hoping to do with D&D is to get more people playing. And they've figured out that the best way to do that is to make the game approachable to everyone. And in that exploration, it's looking at what mistakes that they made in the past and learning how to address them, and how do we try to make this game better, to look at the tropes that have been incredibly problematic. A couple months ago, there was this big discussion around the trope of orcs and how Tolkien's orcs were influenced from more of the idea of the Mongols, and then like it got moved into more of like this thug culture, and specifically in Bright, which was humongously problematic. But they're, instead of just sweeping this stuff under the rug, they're actually having proactive discussions about it and looking at how do we change this thing. There's a supplement that just came out that talks about the idea of race versus culture, and how to build a character where you have some innate abilities from whatever species you are. So if you're an elf, you're long lived, you're a little bit more graceful. But then if you're an elf that was raised by dwarves, you're going to have abilities that come from dwarven culture. And what does that look like? And so it's really breaking it down in a very interesting way. And I think, again, expanding the pool of people who want to play and giving more access and more tools to play, which is absolutely fascinating to me.
So I'd like to add on that too, because from an anthropology standpoint, we talk about advancements in anthropology. We're talking about this. And I love it because at United Experience, this was a lot of our motivation for doing the United Experience, because we want to help change the process and the way people think about things, the way they do business. The way we do business now is people enjoy, I say people, but a lot of businessmen and women like to create products that create dependencies, right? We're trying to create programs that breathe new life in anthropological advancement and inclusivity and diversity. And so, you talking about that, I'm sitting here envisioning a future where our future game developers start developing other games too that are more aware of the impacts of culture, the impacts of choices that people make in every day, the impacts of loving others and what that might look like in an attribute. So you take someone who is raised in a non-inclusive environment, what's going to come of that? What is that child going to be like when they're an adult versus someone who is raised in an inclusive family that is raised with diversity and inclusivity? I would go so far as to say that they're going to understand how to love deeper and have more meaningful, lasting connections than the people who are not.
And I think a big part of this is that, like you guys said earlier, we're having these really hard conversations, and all of this for me is, as an African American man, is like intermingled, like diversity and inclusion, and like how we begin to address racism and systemic racism. All those things are a part of this, and so Megan, I really loved what you said when you talked about kind of being able to delineate between even in D&D, a person's racial characteristics versus their cultural characteristics, and like that's how you start unentwining and starting to help build up and build a better knowledge base for people of saying, well, how do I look at race? Because I mean, traditionally, like when I tell people where I went to college, they say, oh, well, you must have played football or you must play basketball. Like there's this sense of like even these microaggressions of like, oh, well, because you're African American, like you're good at these things. And it's hard to kind of educate people about, well, hey, that's not like, we don't have any evidence that that I run faster, jump higher just because I'm Black, and so, but I think that when we can start importing that into the games that we play, I think it will begin to help people understand that of like, oh, well, because he's Black, he's going to have darker skin, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be able to wield a lightsaber super well, and being able to kind of talk about how those things, we can pull those apart and have better conversations. So I think even just on that level, when I think about how to practically apply these conversations, it's stuff like that really leaps out to me as being on the right track.
I would so agree with that. I was just having a conversation last night with my brother and my mom about all these issues that we were going to be talking about today, and talking about video games and how people of color are not represented in the video games. They're represented in the sports games, football and basketball, but not so much in the fantasy games, role-playing games. They're not there. And so how would they know that they belong in these areas if we're not putting them in these games? Then how would they have the courage to participate in these other things outside of this, like D&D or anime discussions, if they're not seeing themselves there? So I totally agree with that. And talking with my brother also, we were talking about which characters could play different Marvel people, who could play different Marvel characters, and we got to Batman, and we said Idris Elba, and he said no. He flat out said no, and we said what? And he goes, why not? Because he's Black and Batman is white. And I was like, no, that's not how it works. This is all fantasy. Let's not limit ourselves. And I think sometimes we get limited with, like, anime is fantasy. Everything, all these things that we're doing is made up. So why can't everybody be there? Yeah, so it was a really good conversation last night. Fantastic. Yep.
I like that. It's all fantasy. Why can't everybody be there? Like, if we were to end right now, I'd be like, that was a good one. That was a good way to put it. I really like that.
Go ahead, Julie. You haven't talked much, so.
I just was gonna say, I feel like I totally understand that, and I feel like it's also not just fantasy, right? Like what we put into these games, what we play for hours on end a week, right? That's gonna add up in our consciousness and our culture. And so it's kind of like, I guess the difference of being like, it's not race neutral, like trying to put in different cultures and different races and be intentional about that. Just want to add that.
That's a good point. The thing I was going to say is, like, in this homebrew game that I play on Sundays, we've been playing for years, we had an issue where I was talking with the dungeon master about how he was portraying a lot of women in power specifically, and how they all had the kind of same attitude. And he was saying this thing of like, well, they had to overcome. And then he kind of had this moment of like, overcome what? This is my fantasy world. This is my homebrew setting. I don't have to have sexism be a part of this. That it can just be women are treated the same as men from the start. And that freed up a lot of problems that we'd been having in the campaign. And like, it was a lot more fun after that.
So Danny, how obviously you're very versatile in the anime and manga area. So I am very curious on what your view is a little bit on diversity and inclusion within the characters of a manga and anime, because obviously I would, well, not obviously, I would assume that as people watch a lot of anime, we actually don't see a lot of people of color within anime as well. It's a lot of whitewashed individuality, and sometimes what do you kind of see us needing in that area?
What I see us needing in that area is honestly just more creation and more inclusion, like we've been saying. It's really the same thing. But it's also kind of understanding the cultural context. Like, sure, Japan had a March for Black Lives Matter, and that's super awesome. But race over there is very homogenous. They're not seeing everyone. It's not as like heterogeneous as America is. And so while it's very, very like upfront in our faces, and we're facing so many different things every day, we have to remember over there too, it's more of just like small activism and understand the cultural differences and how to bridge all of that. And also, I think it also lies within the fandoms themselves, because I see so many talks about race in anime these days, especially the theory that everyone in anime is actually Japanese, and that all the hair colors you see is just the different undertones, and they're just ignoring the black hair, and they're like, oh, Sakura just has black hair, but it's pink undertones, so they're gonna color it pink. And I was like, what? And like there are many people that like are die hard on that like, no, everyone's Asian in anime, just they just are pale, because that's what a lot of Asian culture values. They also value very pale people, and that's why geishas wore bird poop to make themselves white. Fun fact, the makeup is bird poop.
So Danny, explain that more to me then, because I mean, you just said something like really innocuously that I'm just like, wait, let's back up. So tell me about when I'm watching anime, you know, and what am I supposed to be seeing in terms of representation? Are they supposed to be represented as white, or is it supposed to be more homogenous or more heterogeneous? Like, what am I supposed to be seeing when I'm watching that?
The thing I tell people, and like my students themselves, I'm like, interpret it the way you want, because that's really what a lot of writers like in like for manga and anime are trying to do. They're like, because they're Japanese cultures are not like very upfront with their emotions. Like our field would be kind of like super hard to be in over there. So a lot of like creative writers and stuff, they get their a lot of emotions and angst because it's all super competitive and super high maintenance and anxiety over there. So a lot of their expression comes through like these creative arts, which is why you have the super dark animes that are like super sad, but it's also like their catharsis. So I also, and like the whole race stuff with it, I don't like to shoehorn it unless it's pretty obvious. Like in Digimon, I'm gonna basically say most of them are Japanese because they're all over Tokyo. And Digimon's been a huge part of my life. I'm actually wearing the Crest of Hope right now. But also, like in season 2, you find out TK and Matt are like half French or a quarter French. So I'm like, oh, well, they're mixed. And you just kind of take it as it is. And until they explicitly say, just don't label. Don't assume the things of people. Same thing with gender.
So how do we go about in our different practices, different lifestyles of actually bringing a little bit more of this inclusivity and diversity to it? Because I know here at the Telos project, we focus in primarily on an internal structure where with for our groups and stuff of the kids that need it the most, and we can then make a case to present to insurance to get them to cover it for them as well, so they can get this type of stuff. When we do that, we focus more on that internal structure. But Julia, you also were talking about the external, the community-based type of stuff as well. And Megan, you have 3 all-girl D&D groups, I think, which is super empowerment based as well. So I'm curious. I'm like, what are we kind of doing to do that, and what kind of things can you share with the watchers and the listeners to kind of help bridge this gap, um, this ability to really hone in on the diverse experiences, teach that self-awareness, understand like the goals of the group, and even being vulnerable, because that's big part of what sometimes a lot of people don't understand is that we have to be vulnerable in this situation, and it's not bad to be vulnerable. It's not. It was a big question. I know. Take a moment. It's okay. It was a lot I just threw at you. Anyone can speak up.
I think I'll start a little bit. I think we all said before, talking about like having the hard conversations, being intentional and really thinking about it. Um, and then also just being willing to learn and grow. I think has been the biggest thing for me is like, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I know all of the barriers that my potential clients face in getting into my groups or getting into my practice. I don't, I can sit and brainstorm all day, but then like I'll trick myself into thinking I have thought of everything, and then I close myself off to other possibilities. So I think like one of the biggest superpowers we can have is acknowledging and being okay with not knowing everything and being okay with learning. And the more we're open to learning and growing, the more inclusive I think we can be, because we start to learn other people's experiences and understand those barriers.
For me, like where I work, because I work at multiple schools for my different jobs, and I actually have students who, because the students today, oof, they are on it. And it's very wonderful to see, and I'm very excited to see what becomes of it when they obtain adult rights. So, but still, they're frustrated with like teachers and other things. And the thing I tell them is, you have to meet people where they are, no matter who they are, and then you get them to stretch a little. And because I'm coaching dance stuff too in color guard and winter guard, I'm like, think of it like stretching for a split. If you cannot do a split, you're not going to get it overnight. You have to push it and push it and push it, and eventually you will hit the split. And that's just the metaphor I like to use, because it's simpler, and honestly, it takes a lot off them and like my need to change the world immediately, when I just know just every little bit counts.
Yeah, so for me, I think there's two big things. I'll talk on humility a little bit and then leadership. First being humility. I think in order for us to approach this topic and succeed, we have to be humble, because there are some built-in biases regardless of how hard we try, as part of us just being human. We all have different varying upbringings and backgrounds and exposures, and being humble enough to admit that, I think, is a great starting point, and it's a good baseline for us. So, I just admit that I don't have all the answers either. So I love that you said that, Megan. I think that's a great starting point. And then having done a lot of leadership and led hundreds of people professionally, and that's something I want to speak on a little bit. As a leader, as you guys know, leadership in its simplest form is the influence of people. And I think each and every one of you are leaders, and I think that's a great thing. And I applaud you guys for doing what you're doing, having the courage to help people out, help them think again, help find resources, give them some hope and courage. And I think that's a great starting point that everyone can do, starting with their family and their friends and their social groups and people that they're exposed to. And then in the professional world, I think that's also another way to shine. I even got a shout out from Dr. Bean the other day that was helping me out. I mean, I think that those conversations are important and needed. And one of the things as a leader that I found is equally as important, that some of you have experience with and will probably have more experience in the future, is policy, right? We see a lot of things on policy this, policy that, regarding inclusivity and diversity. But policy isn't impactful without a process to go with it, without a paradigm shift in belief, or what I call the buy-in factor. I can put out policy all day and rules all day, but if nobody believes it and say stuff and nobody believes, it doesn't mean anything if there's no buy-in. And then we have two types of leaders. You have formal leaders, who are people in position, and then informal leaders who, by their charisma, just lead people. And I bet that all of you do both in some capacity, somewhere, sometime. I would add, we combine all that through our education and advocacy for these things, which results in advancement and leveling up of community. I think it's a good starting point.
I can say a few of the just like practical things that I try to do based on learning, right? Based on seeking out trainings and learning in that way. The first thing that came to mind was whenever I read my D&D therapy groups, I'd always post to Lady Geeks of Austin's a Facebook group, shout out, because it's like specifically for ladies, for people who identify as lady. And so it's just kind of an example of, I'm not necessarily reaching out to like Austin Geeks. I don't know if that's a group, but almost, I don't want to use the word target because that seems like kind of icky, but targeting people that are not white men, basically. Then with my therapy groups, I give them lots of space to be empowered. So it's group rules, and it's also like no-go topics at different levels, from like the consultation to while we're playing. I feel like I had another example, but those are the ones that come to mind. Like I tried to putting pronouns on our little cards when we were in person, and then the little name tags, pronouns for your player and for your character. So practicing getting those right. Yeah, those are some like just kind of practical things that I try to do to signal safety, basically.
A big thing I forgot to mention too with my split metaphor is also as you meet people where you are and you help them grow, like, and remember, people could regress as well. And like, I had a split once upon a time. I don't have it now, and I liken it to that too. Like, always give people the benefit of the doubt and assume good intention-ish, but just know that you may have to help them grow back to where they once were, especially if you haven't spoken in a while. I've had a lot of students who are like, they've changed over the summer. I'm like, well, it's only been the summer. You're here like 10 months of the year compared to the 2 you haven't. Talk to them, see how it goes. Evaluate in a month.
I really like that metaphor, Danny, because when you're talking about the splits and I'm thinking about diversity and inclusion, I keep coming back to just Black Panther and just like what that movie meant to me and means to me even now. I think part of it is because that movie came out right around when I had kids, and so I kind of started thinking more in terms of a long-standing legacy and like how will my kids view this stuff growing up. And for me, it was just so interesting that like in terms of not having the split, like when I grew up, like if I was watching anime, if I was watching cartoons, if I was involved in geek culture, I was gonna see a protagonist who was pretty much white all the time, and they were about 35, and like they had all their stuff together, and like they had the barriers were like their parents died, and like that's a huge barrier, make no mistake, but it was a different barrier than like what being a person of color or a minority individual would look like. And so to see Black Panther and to kind of be like, wow, like this is what it looks like, and this is more importantly what it feels like, and also to have that movie and now to be able to show it to my kids growing up and being able to say that like, these are Black superheroes, that we're not excluded from the conversation, that to kind of bring it all the way back around, we're in the room where it happens. See what I did there? You see what I did there? You see, you guys got it. You guys got it.
Well, kind of piggybacking off that too, also just talking about gender representation. Of like, I grew up watching the original She-Ra in the 80s, and I loved it because it was the first like superhero girl that I could see and I could be. But I remember being a child and being annoyed as heck that He-Man had to come on to She-Ra's show sometimes to help her out, but she never went and helped him. And like, what was up with that? And that really annoyed me as a kid. And then to have She-Ra come back around now on Netflix with just thank you, Noelle Stevenson, for making such a freaking amazing show that is wonderful. But I have little girls and them getting to grow up watching that and getting to watch Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman and all these different superheroes that they could see themselves as. It's no longer like having to go, oh, maybe I can pretend to be, a Batgirl. Oh, but Batgirl has to get rescued by Batman all the time. That's not very fun. So having that representation is just humongous for us.
I think that ties into what Mitch was saying, not only with the buy-in with organizations to be more conscious, but buy-in with the community to get into the counseling offices, the therapy offices, to get into the anime and the manga and all that stuff, to say, hey, yeah, this is going to be something that I can get with. I can relate to this. This is okay. And even if I'm a little bit scared, I'm still going to try it because it seems like they're going to make an effort to get me.
Well, I wanted to say thank you all for such amazing and very introspective dialogues here today, because I think that this has been really revealing on kind of where we need to go. We have just a couple more minutes, and I just wanted to let everyone speak kind of one more time if they're okay with it, and kind of saying, what do you see the future needing for more diversity, more inclusion in your area, or even just globally? It's a big question. I'm watching your faces. It's a big question.
I'll start. The future of where I think where we need to go is we need to just advocate more. And a lot of advocacy so far has been just getting the buy-in. getting the buy-in. Well, if one thing quarantine did for the world, I think it made people listen to things. So we finally have buy-in, but now it's time to just keep going momentum-wise, actually push, and not forget about it when we're all not hiding.
A big thing I heard earlier with the levels was kind of what the barrier for entry is. And this is going to say a lot about me and my voting strategy, but like being in mental health, I am such a believer that the barrier for entry for so many people is too high. They're like, how am I going to give an hour of my time coming to your office and paying this amount of money, when I'm trying to put food on the table? And so for me, I think whether you're talking about geek culture or mental health or just a lot of things in life, I think the goal is to lower the barrier of entry, not to lower the standards, but to more so say, how can we help people who may never go to a therapeutic D&D group, or who may never find that niche that helps them belong, that's a part of geek culture. How can we help make this accessible for them? Back in the day, if you wanted to play Halo, you had to have an Xbox, you had to have a landline, you had to have an internet connection that didn't tie into your phone line. Like that's a big thing. You're going to price yourself out of a lot of people, and the hope is that as we continue to progress is that we're going to be able to remove some of those things and say, hey, now I know some of them can connect via Wi-Fi. I'm totally speaking out of my lane now. So I don't know. Tony can tell you about that stuff. But so to speak, that there's a lot of ways we can lower the barrier of entry and make sure that people can have access to all these great things that for a while only a few people could access.
I think speaking just specifically to like the Dungeons and Dragons realm, because it's where my geekdom is primarily, but continuing to look at the tropes and to look at the problems and again how to widen things. I think it's a very big part of narrative stuff and running games is also you don't want to paint yourself into a corner, right? You want to keep all your options open. And I think that's something that we need to look at, whether we're looking at what do we need to do to change out how monsters are aligned, what the alignments mean, how things behave. The more open we can be, the more people can come in, and the more people that are in your fandom, the better, because then your fandom just keeps growing and you get more stuff.
And who doesn't like stuff?
It is my most clinical term of all clinical terms. So we want more stuff out there, whether it be, fan fiction or games or dice or whatever. More stuff.
It just reminds me of the meme of Fry, take my money.
I think it's the answer to diversity and inclusivity starts with you today and with us. To love your neighbor, to love yourself.
Short and sweet as always, Mitch. I love it. Julia Nirak?
I think everyone pretty much said everything. I mean, I think it was good comments. I think accessibility, loving yourself, loving others, and not limiting your thoughts, not limiting how you view people, are all key to diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add to this wonderful pot is just empowering other people. When you like their stuff, tell them that you like their stuff, support them, compensate them, and encourage them to keep going.
Julie, if I can piggyback off that, I love that you just said that, to tell people you like their stuff. Like we know from science, like in studying the brain, we pay attention to the negative comments so much more than the positive, and you need it's a 5-to-1 ratio of good stuff to bad stuff. So like if you like somebody's art, if you like somebody's creation, tell them, let them know, like, tweet about it, wherever, like let people know that you like what they're doing, because like putting that love and that support out there, I think is so important because it encourages people.
Well, I appreciate you all, and I hope everyone learned a great deal about this stuff when we have been talking about this. And thank you all for being so awesome in this panel. And we will pass it off to the next panel now. Thank you.